You are Locked On Fantasy Basketball, your daily fantasy basketball podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello and welcome to the Locked On Fantasy Basketball podcast, brought to you by Basketball Monster. My name is Josh Lloyd and I am the lead fantasy analyst at basketballmonster.com and at Yahoo Sports Australia. And you can find me on Twitter as always at redrock_bball and on Instagram at Locked On Fantasy Basketball. Today, we're looking at the dynasty value of players in a couple of teams in the Eastern Conference, the Detroit Pistons and the Cleveland Cavaliers. Michael Bolton.
Let's get to it.
Let's get to it indeed. Now, to kick off things with the Detroit Pistons, I am going to bring in the host of the Locked On Pistons podcast. Matt Shook is going to be here with me, and we're going to kick things off by talking about their first round pick from this current season, and that is Sekou Doumbouya. Now, let's bring in Matt of Locked On Pistons. Matt, welcome back to the show, and we're here to talk about the Pistons' first round pick from this past draft, and that is Sekou Doumbouya. He was the starter for a period of time. Now, I've been pretty frustrated with how Dwayne Casey has used him. Not that Sekou has been fantastic, but I guess they're pushing back and forward into the lineup, out of the rotation, back to the G League, back into the rotation, in a season where the Pistons have made it clear they're looking to rebuild and then giving him limited minutes. What is the reason behind, especially recently, why Sekou just really hasn't been playing all that much at all, despite the forward-focusing nature of the Pistons season at the moment?
Yeah, it's been a strange season for him, like you mentioned. The 2019 portion of the season, he was pretty much in Grand Rapids more than Detroit by a wide margin. And then right when the calendar flipped to 2020, the very first game of that slate, they went out west, and he inserted Sekou into the starting lineup to go up against no less than Kawhi Leonard, and then Golden State and Draymond Green, and where he defended him, LeBron James and the Lakers, and on to Cleveland and Chicago. And really, we're talking about a 7-game stretch, actually an 8-game stretch here, which was by far his best stretch of the season. 14 points per game and 5 rebounds. So was productive in that time, but then started to coast a little bit and float. I just think he ran into a rookie wall with all that he dealt with in his first year as an 18-year-old, turned 19-year-old late in December. And Dwayne Casey, while he gets a lot of credit for developing players kind of in a macro sense, that doesn't necessarily mean that he's going to give them big minutes. We saw that with Luke Kennard in his first couple years, and we're seeing it with Sekou too. He wants his guys to go out there and earn it, as opposed to just throwing them out on the court and doing a lot of the little things in practice and defensively that are kind of culture-building things, but that doesn't help your fantasy team, that's for sure.
It was a weird thing because he did start that game against the Clippers, played well, was really good the next game against the Warriors, and in fact, in those first 8 games, he scored in double-digit points in 7 of those games, and the game on the 15th of January had 24 points against the Celtics, was shooting well, and then after that, it all disappeared, and everything after that, he scored in double digits 1 game. He couldn't hit shots, and this is pure speculation, but I wouldn't be surprised if something odd happened between that Celtics and Hawks game, because it is such a staggering drop-off for a guy whose trajectory was pushing forward and he was playing well, and then he just did not score. He just couldn't hit shots. He lost minutes. Everything disappeared after that 8-game stretch. It was a really weird, very abrupt sort of drop-off from Sekou. Of course, that doesn't have any necessarily bearing on what he's going to do in the future or what his role is on this team. He went back to the G League and had some pretty productive performances there. But in terms of his future role on this team, he started at power forward. He took over that spot from Blake Griffin. Do you see him more as a 4? Will he eventually play next to other big men, maybe as a 3, replacing Tony Snell down the line? What's his best position on this team, do you think?
Yeah, I think that they wanted to start him basically at the 3 because it's a little bit easier of a position to learn physically, because you're not going to run up against some bigger guys. I think defensively it was a little bit easier for him. Defensively is where he's struggling right now. So, but going forward, with the hope that the Pistons have Blake Griffin coming back at least somewhat healthy going into next season, and of course Tony Snell, like you mentioned, he is under contract for 1 more year. So I really don't see that role changing all that much. Those of you who might hope that Sekou makes a huge step forward statistically in year 2, I really don't see it. I think you're going to see another year 2 of one step forward, maybe two steps back at times. And then going into year 3, when hopefully the Pistons have started to turn the corner a little bit as a franchise and turning into a winning team, I think then that's maybe when you see Sekou step into a starting role. Really, if you look at the young group of these guys with the Pistons, there's some guys with talent, but I think Sekou's the one guy that you look at on this roster as possibly being a possible, some sort of semblance of a building block going forward. So I think that that's the hope. And obviously, with a 19-year-old that's had only a few good weeks of NBA play in his career, certainly there's a big risk of never reaching any kind of potential like that. But there's enough tools there to be excited that there could be a little bit of an upside, but I think it's a couple of years away from being a consistent NBA performer.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I would say probably his year 3 or year 4 is when he starts to push into that more consistent sort of a role. In terms of what he did in the G League this year, he did hit 2 threes a game. He shot them at 36%, which is an encouraging thing. Strong from the free throw line. Yeah, I worry about some of his other areas of his game, like will he ever get assists or defensive stats? Like they are maybe a concern, but I think there is some offensive ability there. A strong rebounding ability potentially can come as well from Sekou. So there is some pretty strong dynasty upside. His advanced stats this season are pretty rough, but I think we expect that from a young guy. And he is, as you said, Matt, that guy on this team, the young player with the most potential probably of anyone on this roster outside of whatever happens in this upcoming draft. Matt, thanks for coming on and talking about Doumbouya with us here on Locked On Fantasy Basketball, and all of your Pistons information. Matt will be having that for you right across on Locked On Pistons. Matt, thank you.
Thanks, Josh.
All right, so let's move on to some other of these Pistons players. Now, the first guy I'm going to talk about outside of Sekou is Christian Wood, the crucifix. We all know that Wood has been ridiculous since moving into the starting lineup. Over the course of the season, he's still not a top 120 player, despite playing 21 minutes per night. But of course, since he moved into that big role, he's been close to a top 20 guy. And that brings in the discussion, what the hell is Wood as we move forward? There's a couple of things to remember. He has always had this really, really strong per-minute ability. We saw it with Philadelphia to a degree, with Charlotte, especially with New Orleans, a little bit with Milwaukee, but we've seen this, and we saw it at the end of last season with the Pelicans especially, that he can do this. He's had off-court issues. He still has some defensive IQ issues, which do lead to concerns. But what we're seeing here, say over his last 9 games where he is the 20th ranked player, averaging 24 and 10, a steal, a block, 1.5 threes, 57 and 66. That's elite fantasy production, 39% from 3. He does have a 27% usage though, and this is a team without Blake Griffin, without Derrick Rose, without Luke Kennard. Now, theoretically, all 3 of those guys will be ready to start next season. So where does Wood fit in the offensive usage pecking role? Probably behind Blake, probably behind Derrick Rose, who doesn't take a backseat to anybody, and maybe behind Luke Kennard. So while it's not going to impact him massively in some of his other areas, like the rebounding will still be okay. Blake's not a good rebounder anymore. So he's still going to have that level. The efficiency, he's still going to be relatively efficient, but he's only like a 76%, 74% free throw guy, which is actually a negative. It's okay for a big man, but it's not a great number. Will he get that many shot attempts? I would say no. Will he continue? And again, we look at Christian Wood, and I like him. I like him a lot. He's averaging less than a block a game. And in those 9 games at 35 minutes a game, 1 block per game. That's not good. 1.1 steals, pretty solid. But what he is at the moment is an extremely high usage big man, and I just don't think that usage is going to be there. Now, his advanced stats are fantastic. Like, he's leading this team in PIPM by an absolute country mile. Wins added, he's smashing it as well. I think he can be a Thomas Bryant-ish type player, probably a better Thomas Bryant player. But this level of production, this level of usage where he's doing whatever he wants on an absolute disaster of a team, I don't see it being a thing for next season. He'll be 25 next season. He's got a couple more years after that. I think he's at significant risk of being overdrafted and overvalued in dynasty leagues as we move forward because of this little run. And we don't realize just how much of an impact usage has. Have a look at Kemba Walker this season. Going from Charlotte to Boston, lose that usage, you lose value. Like, you come in here and instead of having 27% usage and instead of scoring 24 points per game, he comes in and scores 16, still really good, but 16 points, loses some threes, loses the impact that he has in field goal percentage because his usage overall drops. not buoyed up by assists or block numbers, which aren't all that good. I think there's a worry there. Now, I really like him. I think he can be a starting center, but if they land a pick in the top 3 and end up with James Wiseman, like what the hell happens with Wood then? He's not going to be outplaying, he probably will be outplaying Wiseman, but he's not necessarily going to be organizationing him, like not putting him, like the organization go, screw that, we've got Wood, we can't have Wiseman or we can't develop Wiseman. So there is some risk, I think, with him. As well as he's played, I'm not fully convinced that on a good team, on a full roster, that he can continue to do that. In fact, I think the odds of that are pretty highly unlikely despite how well he has played. Let's now look at his young teammate in the backcourt.
Baby shark,
Brucie Brown, who has been, like, I could name this for so many players through NBA history, dicked around by Dwayne Casey. Brown started the season on the bench, moved into the starting lineup eventually, and then we've seen him go back and forward from point guard to shooting guard. Casey says no, he's not a point guard. Then a month later plays him a point guard, and he of course 100% shows that he can be a point guard and is a point guard. But again, where's he fitting on this team? When Derrick Rose comes back, will they start Rose next season over Brown? Probably. I really think that Bruce Brown has a real chance to be a solid fantasy contributor as we move forward. A really positive defensive player. He's shooting the ball okay, 34% from 3, 38% over his last 17 games, which is a real improvement. 4 assists, 5.5 rebounds. But one thing that has dropped off for him, which was really good last season, are his defensive numbers. He's only at 1.1 steals, which is a little bit of a disappointment considering his playing time. You'd hope for a little bit more there. But his block numbers have also fallen off. I think he can be a 1.4 steals guy, 0.8 blocks guy with 5 or 4 rebounds, 5 assists, 15 points. Maybe he tops out at that. And that would possibly push him to be a Patrick Beverley type, top 100 borderline fantasy player. I don't think he's anyone, and if they got a pick there, they probably should be looking at a LaMelo Ball or a Anthony Edwards or a guard along those lines rather than a big man necessarily, because I don't think we rely upon Brown. But I think he can have a couple of season run of being a solid enough guy to at least have some reliability in your backcourt, and he has flashes of some really, really good games. The Duck, Luke Kennard, it's been obviously a frustrating season for Kennard this year. Only 28 games. He's averaged 16 points. I thought he could be a breakout guy this season, and he did sort of break out. I guess it's his best season. But what we did see with Kennard is he played so well when Blake Griffin was out. Griffin came back, and it muted him completely. So when Rose and Griffin are back next season, and Kennard also has to battle Christian Wood for shots, what the hell is he going to do when he doesn't get those shots? Because he started out so well, like really, really strong. 30 points on opening night, big runs, and then Griffin came back and we saw the numbers drop off consistently. And then Griffin went out and his numbers went back up. He can handle the ball a little bit, but they'll never trust him to be a full-time point guard, unfortunately. He does have some concerns defensively, but I think they might be a little bit overblown. I still think that Kennard can be a useful fantasy guy, and he should be absolutely penciled in as a 32-minute-a-night starter next season. But again, when Griffin was there, he struggled. When Rose is playing next to him, he struggles a little bit as well. That's just too many usage guys around. Of course, they should be prioritizing someone like Kennard over Rose, but this is Detroit, this is Dwayne Casey, and those sort of things don't always go that way. I would suggest that Kennard will never become a top 50 fantasy guy, and maybe he tops out as a top 80 player would be my guess. He is still he's not even 24 yet, so I reckon you've got 4 more years of him. I reckon you've got about a 4-year window of him being a back-end close, between 120 and 90 type or 80 type ranked player, but just finding that right area to expand those other things. And he's a shit-house steals guy, gets no blocks as well. But can he push to 5 assists, Bradley Beal-esque assist level? That's a possibility. That's where he can jump up. And I think 18 points per game, he probably can top out as a scorer around that area. Mchale. Svi has had multiple opportunities this season, of course, with Kennard going down and Brown having his own injuries. Svi has started some games. He's been much better here than he was for the Lakers, but that doesn't necessarily mean that he is going to be good, because I think he's been okay. Like, he's been solid enough, not necessarily someone where I go, well, this is absolutely someone we've got to build around. But in saying all that, he still has a plus 4.3 in his on-off, which is a really strong number. It's behind Wood, who's an 8.5. It's ahead of Kennard, it's ahead of Brown, it's ahead of Snell, quite obviously, because Snell's not good. It's ahead of Doumbouya, which is one of the worst on the team. So Svi has been, I guess, a little bit more impressive, and he's hitting threes in a big amount. There's also why I say don't prioritize threes, because you can find a Svi who gives you 2 a game pretty comfortably, and that's exactly what he's doing. He's still not shooting well. He gets you nothing assist-wise or steal-wise, and rebounds. It's under 2 a game. Like, that's pretty rough from Mchale. But at least he's shown an ability to come out and be a 3-point shooter. But in terms of long-term range for him, I don't really see him ever being a superb option. Next up, of course, it is Thon Mchale, the player who started games ahead of Christian Wood many times this season. He had a little run post-trade deadline, replacing Andre Drummond, where he was okay. That's the best I can say about Thon. He is still the 336th ranked player this season. He rebounds at a horrendously bad level. He can block some shots, but the free throw shooting is bad. The field goal percentage is at the best it's ever been, but it's still over 50%. He gets no assists. He gets no steals. Rebounding at 7.7 per 36 is atrocious for a bloke his size. 1.3 per 36 is atrocious as well. I just don't really ever see it for Thon to be someone who is going to be a fantasy force, really, at any point, unfortunately. I just don't see the jump up from him. He saw that little flash of performance, which was okay from Thon, but the on-off stuff is pretty rough. The PIPM stuff is pretty rough as well for Thon, and I just don't really see him as a long-term option. Of course, Christian Wood's ahead of him. They shouldn't really be playing those two together. The Muppet John Henson's around. Griffin's going to come back. Do they draft a big man? Thon, to me, yes, he's only allegedly 22 or 23, but I just don't see really any top 150 upside from Thon, despite that little run post All-Star break where he had, or post-trade deadline where he had 12 and 12, 18 and 2, and 11 and 6. And since then, he's done absolutely nothing in those opportunities that he has been given. We've talked about Sekou already. Kyrie Thomas is a guy that shot really well in college, 40% three-point shooter, but injuries have ruined his NBA career so far. Only 8 games this season, 8 minutes a night. It's really hard to get a full read on Kyrie, who did come in, I think, with a decent level of upside as a player. I think from Creighton he came out of as that really good shooter, but we just haven't seen it. Injuries have bothered him. I don't really think that he's necessarily a long-term NBA player. He did average 21 points a game in the G League last season, but very little else. Now, he's consistently shot well in the G League, 45% across his 12 games in the G League. Extremely low sample size, but still that's encouraging. But everything else, there's just not much else there from Kyrie Thomas that I get excited about. Jordan Bone, a two-way player who was selected towards the end of the second round of this year's draft. He's had some flashes, but they continue to give opportunities to guys like Brandon Knight or guys like Langston Galloway. Instead of giving any sort of development to Bone, he's only played 10 games and 5 minutes per game this season. But in the G League, I think he's looked pretty good. 18 points, 7 assists, 38% on 6.5 three-point attempts per game, a steal a game, like some pretty solid numbers from him. His defensive stuff, I think, has been okay in the G League as well. I think there is some potential there for Bone. And if I'm looking at players like Mchale or Kyrie Thomas as maybe a guy that I take a flyer on that might develop into I always use this guy as my example, a player who can be a 20-minute-a-night backup who also crosses over and plays a couple of minutes with the starters, JJ Barea. He's done that multiple years for the Mavericks. I think Bone's got the ability to do that ahead of someone like a Thomas who could develop. Now, he's still obviously a long way away from doing that, where you're not even close to him being a rotation player. He is 22 already, so He's a little bit of an older rookie, but I think there's a little bit of interest there in what Bone can do despite the limited sample size that we have seen this season. I thought he looked okay during his time on the court. And the last guy on this list is Dante Hall, who really we haven't seen much of at all. Signed during the season, 4 games, 12 minutes a game. He averaged 4 rebounds during that time, which of course is a pretty interesting number in those that limited amount of playing time. Can he be a player that sticks? He's a 6'9" forward who in the G Leagues averaged 15 and 11. And the problem is he doesn't shoot. Like 26% from 3 on limited attempts, only 1.4 blocks. He's had his G League numbers are unbelievable. True shooting of 76%, a PER of almost 26 as well. The actual field goal percentage is ridiculous for Hall, but I feel like he's a little bit undersized to be able to do that in the NBA. But at least there is something to look at and go, well, there's a building block there for what Hall can do. Can he continue to be a guy that at least pushes on the fringes, or does he end up like an Alize Johnson or a Miller Jefferson for the Orlando Magic? That sort of power forwardish guy who puts up good G League type numbers, but can never translate it further. I think there's a risk of that with Hall, and out of those guys, Doumbouya is obviously the best of those young prospects. Kennard and Wood are pretty established. Brown sort of in that next level of established guys, and then out of the Mchale and Makers and Thomas, Bone and Hall, it is probably Bone, the guy that I take a look at there. All right, let's now move on and talk about the other team that we're going to talk about today, and that is the Cleveland Cavaliers. I am going to be joined soon by Chris Manning of Locked On Cavs to talk about Kevin Porter Jr., but let's talk about some of these other guys right now. Let's start by looking at Collin Sexton, who was the starting point guard last season, the starting shooting guard this season, and was really rough to begin this year, but he has powered home, and over the last 25 games, he's a top 40 player, averaging 24 points per game on 50% shooting. Now, he still lacks quite a bit in other areas, but to his credit, he has doubled his steal numbers this year, which is super impressive. He's improved his assist numbers, despite not playing as the primary ball handler. He's hitting a bigger volume of threes. He's getting to the line a lot more. Now, I have shit on Collin Sexton a lot. He still has massive defensive concerns to me. A terrible defensive PIPM, and still overall by that metric is a negative player. And the future projection stuff doesn't necessarily look great there. But the fact that he is doing this level of scoring on this level of usage at this high of a true shooting, 61% true shooting over the last 25 games on 27 usage is absolutely fantastic. Plus doubling your steal numbers and giving 4 assists. Now, the problem is if he was put into the point guard role, I'm not sure he'd average more than 4 assists per game. But, I will criticize blokes when it's deserved. But when they change their game and improve, then I will also give them that credit. And that's exactly what I'm doing here with Sexton, because he's improved his ability to get steals, and he has improved his assist numbers, and he is scoring at a huge rate, and he's improved his three-point volume and kept up the percentages, which is a huge thing to do. So I think we have to be relatively confident that Sexton can do that. Now, if we ever find him on a team where he's not getting every shot that he wants, and I don't know if that's ever going to be the case on this Cavs team, like what are they going to do? Like, I'm not sure Garland's ever going to develop. Do they find another superstar somewhere? I'm not really sure about that. Can he continue? Look, if he gets this role, I don't see any reason why he doesn't stick at this level of efficiency. The problem then is if he loses the usage, can anything else step up? Will he ever become a good rebounder? I doubt it. I don't think he's ever going to become even passably good there. Can he ever become a guy that if he's not averaging 24 points per game and has to go to a 17, 18 point per game role, can he ever push to 7 assists? Probably not. Is 1 steal his ceiling? Maybe he can get a little bit higher. But the encouraging thing here is how well he has done this season. And I think we look at him as probably a top 50, 60 guy for the next 3 to 4 seasons would be my guess. I don't know if he can push higher than the top 40 he is at the moment over this little stretch. That might be a little bit hard to expect. I think he's probably more of that guy that I'd feel comfortable as 50 to 70 type of a player who doesn't push much higher for about 3 to 4 seasons, and then maybe we get a drop off. But he's proven me wrong already. So we'll see if he can push forward any more and improve those areas. But it's been a really impressive run here from Collin Sexton. His teammate, Darius Garland, it has not been good for him at all. As it hasn't been good for a lot of rookies, he has the worst wins out on this team, taking wins away, negative 0.78. Offensively, defensively, he's struggled as well. It has just been really rough. Now, we only saw 5 games of Garland last season in college, a really small sample size. Did that fool teams into thinking that maybe he could be good? I was actually in on Garland. I thought, yeah, maybe there's some value here. The 3-point shooting, is that going to be real? He can distribute the ball better than Sexton, but maybe they don't need him. Like, they just need to put Sexton into that role and get someone else to play alongside him, because it has been rough. He's the 202nd ranked player this season, Garland, in 31 minutes, shooting 40% only. Under 4 assists, 0.7 steals, under 2 rebounds. Somehow he's worse than Sexton as a rebounder. Steals are pretty low. He's still shooting 36% from 3, which is okay. But the advanced numbers are really rough for Garland. I think that I know that he'll be better than this. It's not about getting more minutes because the minutes are there. It's about converting at a higher rate. Just 43% on his 2s. He needs to be much better in that area, pretty obviously. I'm not sure if he's ever going to be a 20-point per game guy, 7 assists, but I think he's got a more of a 7 assist upside than what Sexton does. Can he push into being a top 100 player? I think he will have top 100 seasons in his future, about 3 years away. But I also think there's probably an even chance that he never develops into a good NBA player, and after 3 years, the team just goes, you're not going to be a starting point guard. We need to move in a different direction. It has been absolutely rough as shit for him this season. Hopefully he can turn it around, but not a great start for Darius Garland's career. Next up, we look at Shetty Osman, who had a real opportunity last season with Love injured, no one else around to have his best fantasy season. He didn't really take advantage of that. He's the 180th ranked player so far this year. He's got a horrendous negative 2.43 PIPM. He's 161st last year. He is not a long-term starter. He will continue to go down from here, and I don't think we ever see a top 200 season again from Osman. I like him. I think he's got an ability to pass, but we haven't really seen that throw out. The usage is low. The efficiency is bad. The defensive stats are horrible. I really think that this is the last season we see Osman as a full-time starter in the NBA. I just don't really believe in him, as you're all relatively well aware, I'm guessing. All right, now I will bring in the host of the Locked On Cavs podcast. Chris Manning is here, and we're going to talk about Kevin Porter Jr., the 30th pick in the last NBA draft, who really has established himself as a key piece of this Cavs team, averaging 23 minutes a night. Had that knee injury, which looked pretty rough in January, but came back from that relatively quickly and settled into a pretty strong groove. Now, he's only started a handful of games this season. And unfortunately, we haven't got to see everything with him, and then suffered that concussion in the last game before things were cancelled. But in terms of what Porter has shown so far this season, Chris, where do you think his role is on this team? Is it perhaps as a guard alongside Collin Sexton or Garland, one of those two? Is it as the future small forward ahead of Shetty Osman? Where is he supposed to fit on this team?
I think the clear thing, and I think the thing that matters most for a team that is still kind of 3-ish years probably away from kind of making a real jump again, is that he's a building block. I think this is a guy that's going to play. I think you're going to see him play shooting guard. I think you're going to see him play small forward. I think you're going to see him, depending on what he's 6'6". He's listed as 6'4". One of the favorite things this year is that I think he's taller. I think he's like 6'6", 6'7". I think he's grown. I think he could put on some muscle and get stronger, and theoretically he could get to a point where he could defend some 4s. I think no matter, I don't know exactly what his long-term sort of fit is. I think the clearest thing that we learned this year is that this is a guy that's been the best Cavs rookie this year. I think he's definitely outperformed Garland. I think he's a building block. I think he can definitely score the basketball, and other parts of his game kind of can be hit or miss, but I think the guy's got a real future in the NBA, and I think that's as clear as we know right now, and there's just a lot of different possible outcomes for him otherwise.
Yeah, I think in terms of being the best rookie, that's pretty clear. He's clearly outperformed Garland. Some of the concerns for him coming in out of college were, like, he was a really weirdly poor free throw shooter. That's stabilized this season, so he's been shooting at 72%. Still not great, but not at the 50-odd% he was at USC. But he had a lot of criticisms regarding just being a real ISO ball hog sort of a guy who wouldn't really fit that team structure and ball movement sort of thing that is common in the NBA when you're not the star player. How have you seen Porter adjust to that? How has his passing looked? Has it just been a lot of ISO heavy diets? Has he fit into that NBA scheme a little bit better than maybe some were anticipating?
I think he has. I mean, I think number one, I think he impressed every veteran that I talked to on the team, like coming into the year and kind of throughout the year, like has raved about him. When I talked to Darius Thornwell, who's like kind of a journeyman, did end up making the team. But when I talked to him in July, I'm like, what is it like being working on the rookies? The guy he's identified right away was Kevin Porter Jr. Like, he said, that guy can hoop, that guy can play. Talked to Larry Nance on Locked On Cavs about a week ago, and he raved about Kevin Porter Jr. I think the guy has come in. I think, he certainly, learned a lot from what went wrong at USC. I think he's the passing stuff, some of the non-isolation scoring stuff is coming along. It's going to take some time because he is just so raw. You mostly then a defensive end, but it's the creation stuff is kind of right there. But I think he has good instincts. I think his IQ for the game is a lot higher than you would have guessed. And I think, the Cavs were a team, and I'm sure they weren't the only one that had him as a top 10 talent in the draft. And I think the potential for that is right there. He's been really, really impressive. But I think the next, if you're looking at how he's adjusted, he can score, he can do a lot of different stuff. And I think the next step is just figuring out what his next sort of additions to his game are going to be, and that'll kind of determine where we go from here.
If he is playing minutes at small forward, how is his defense held up? Can he guard wings? There was some concern about his defensive ability coming in. Of course, that's obviously a huge concern with the current backcourt as well. So can he cover some of their mistakes? Can he be an average to above average defender, or has he shown that so far?
The potential's there. I don't think he's shown that yet, because I think you see a guy who he's got a very, very high foul rate. Rob Mahoney from The Ringer had him as a doing stuff all-star. Basically means he's just like always kind of doing stuff on the floor, and the foul rate's a part of that. I mean, he's very foul prone. He's kind of gets flat-footed sometimes and makes mistakes. But the Cavs have also asked a lot of him. I think there's been times this year where, because they don't really have a primary wing defender type on the roster, they just send him out there and he'll defend James Harden. He'll defend Jason Tatum. Like, he'll defend the best opposing scorer on a team, and he sometimes really does well. And you're like, wow, like, I didn't think he could do this. But he commits a lot of fouls. He kind of does get error prone a lot. I think one of the things that unfortunately we don't know now is that I think he was due for kind of a bump on that end of the floor, because J.B. Bickerstaff really was scaling back the complexity of the Cavs defensive scheme, and I think that was going to help someone like Kevin Porter Jr. in particular. And I'll be curious to. He's a guy that I haven't looked at his defensive stats very much. I don't really want to buy into like DRPM right now and kind of just knock him too much for being 19 and bad at defense, because this is a 19-year-old kid. But I think the potential's there. I don't think he's ever going to be like a lockdown number one defender. But I think if you're thinking about guys on the Cavs that could have two-way potential, be someone you trust to not get smoked on defense in a playoff series in 5 years, he's 100% a guy that I view as being capable of that.
His defensive PIPM is higher than Sexton, Osman, Garland, Love, Tristan Thompson, Jordan Clarkson when he was on the team, Brandon Knight, higher level than all those guys, only really behind Nance and Matty Dellavedova in terms of the rotation players, in terms of his defensive impact in that metric. So that's something to look at, especially as a rookie who often struggle in that area. I think he's got a potential to be a multi-season 30-plus minute a game guy who might have one or two 20-point scoring seasons. It's whether he can bring the other stuff in. Can he bring some assists in as a facilitator? Can he provide some defensive stats? Can he be efficient? And I think there's all the building blocks are there. I think he's probably got a little bit more upside overall than what Darius Garland does. Do you see it that way as well?
Yeah, I think Garland, I kind of give him a mulligan on this year, because if you look at what has happened, this is a guy that played 5 games in college and then unfortunately had to come in the NBA. So I think that's a problem. But I think if you look at Kevin Porter Jr. and you look at him, I think if you're looking at the Cavs' building plan, Sexton can be polarizing, but I think he's clearly good. Garland, we'll see what happens. We'll see with Dylan Windler. I like Jetty, but we'll kind of see what happens with him kind of long term. But when I look at KPJ, I think there's a lot of outcomes. I think the highest he could go is as a good number 2. That's playing 30 minutes a game, that can score for you pretty efficiently, that can play some defense. I don't think he's ever going to be that lead number 1 type. I think the Cavs are still looking for that kind of franchise guy. But if you're looking at a guy who has a ceiling of being, I think his outcomes are somewhere ranging from kind of solid NBA bench guy, can score, going to provide solid defense, just be like a above replacement level defensive player, with the highest outcome of him being like a number 2 guy on a good team. I think that's the ceiling for Kevin Porter, is him just clicking in all ways that he could be that good of a player, and depending on how he develops the next couple of years.
It is going to be interesting to see how this all works out with this team. So many pieces still in flux. Chris, you're going to have coverage for us over on Locked On Cavs, and thanks for jumping on with me today on Locked On Fantasy Basketball.
Hey, no problem. Pleasure to do it.
The next guy is a little bit harder to talk about, and that is Dylan Windler, who hasn't played in the NBA all season, has been ruled out for the season. Now, who knows if the season does return, whether he comes back. He played just 2 games in the G League, 37 minutes, and scored under 7 points per game, shooting 29% from 3. I thought he looked pretty good in Summer League. A high rebounding player out of Belmont who can bang in threes. I think there is a role for him on this team. Now, I could see a scenario where the Cavs go with Sexton, Porter, Windler in future seasons, and move on from Darius Garland, play him as a 6th man. I don't really think that Windler can be a guy to be a consistent 4. I think as a 3 next to Porter, there's the potential there. He did translate really well fantasy-wise coming out of college because of that really high rebound rate. He had some okay defensive numbers. He passed the ball a little bit. He shot some threes. So he's someone I think we can buy a little bit low on in Dynasty leagues. It's really hard to get a full grasp on what he can do at this point because of the injuries. But I really do like the potential of what Windler can do, and someone I don't think we should be discounting at this point. I'm pretty happy to go ahead and discount Dante Exum, though. Injuries really have ruined his career. We saw that one explosion once he came across from Jordan Clarkson, or for Jordan Clarkson in that trade. But otherwise, he just doesn't do it. He does not get high usage. He doesn't score well. He doesn't hit threes. He doesn't get assists. He doesn't get defensive stats. Despite being a good defensive player, he doesn't put up the numbers. And I think when we're talking about Exum here, who we're 5 years into his career, I just don't really see, so it's his 5th season, I don't really see a turnaround happening for him. He is shooting at 35% from 3, which is by far the best number of his career. It's on an extraordinarily low amount of attempts, only 1.2 per game, so it's really hard to buy too much into that. He is a very good defensive player, but there's just so little else that he does, and the defensive stuff doesn't translate into fantasy defensive stats, and it doesn't keep him in the mix enough to be a useful player. Now, it does give him a rotation role, a 20-minute-a-night role, but a 15-minute-a-night role, whatever it is. But I don't think we should be looking at Exum, who still isn't even 25 yet, to be someone who is going to be an impact player for us as we move forward, unfortunately, for Dante. And then at the end of the Cavs roster, we've got guys like Dean Wade, a 2-way big man who's played 12 games this season, 69% shooting.
Giggity!
Look, I don't really... It's just more of a situation where Wade is putting up numbers because of what this team is, or getting actual playing time because of this team. I don't think he's any sort of long-term prospect. He's averaging 14 and 7.5 in the G League with 1.4 blocks. He can hit threes, almost 2 a game in the G League, but not someone that I put a huge amount of faith in. Same goes with Tyler Cook, another big man who was a 2-way player for the Cavs. He's played 11 games so far this season. We had moments where he was getting minutes because Thompson was out and Love was out and Nance was out, and we'd see a little bit from Tyler Cook, but nothing that's overly exciting. He's averaged 13 points a game in the G League this season with 6 rebounds. He doesn't shoot the 3. He doesn't block shots. He doesn't get steals. He's significantly below someone like Wade to me, but still neither of those are all that high. While Ante Žižić has been really disappointing in his couple of seasons coming across, had excellent numbers over in Europe, but it has not translated so far in the NBA. He struggles with the defensive stats. He can get high field goal percentage. He can get good free throw percentage, but he won't hit threes. He's a points and rebounds, a significantly worse Enes Kanter is how I'd be looking at Zizic. It's been really disappointing his season, and I don't think he has got really all that long left in the NBA. Wouldn't be putting much faith in him. A guy that I was pretty high on when he came across as a dynasty prospect, but it has not worked out, and we've seen 2 years of it now. And this is the third season of him in the NBA, and nothing has really made me go back to my initial interpretation of Zizic and go, yeah, well, that was spot on, because I don't think it was. That will do it for today's show, guys. Don't forget, subscribe, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Stitcher, Spotify, YouTube, and don't forget to check out today's episode of Locked On NBA by telling your smart device to play Locked On NBA. Guys, we are done here. Thank you so much for listening, everyone. See ya.